If you're like a lot of people, then to you, RPG Maker probably shares a bit in common with Unity, in that when you hear that a game has been made with either engine, chances are your first thought is along the lines of, great, another one of those games. You know the kind I'm talking about. Games with the least amount of effort put into development that use barely anything more than base assets and are at best tolerable and at worst a broken mess. Well, I'm here to tell you that that is not the case. Well, not necessarily, anyway. In the right hands, an RPG Maker game can be one of the most beautifully crafted, well-written experiences you'll ever come across. And despite the name of the engine, many of the games made with it aren't necessarily RPGs. And so I've set out to find some RPG Maker titles where combat is non-existent or is not the primary focus. Basically games that could fall under any genre but RPG, and see if we can go some way towards dispelling the engine's negative reputation. Here's what I found this time. First, is it an RPG? Is it a dating sim? We'll hopefully find out as we join the crew of the Pegasus 5. Then we'll take a nice relaxing break on the farm in World's Dawn. Finally, we'll take a gigantic leap out of my comfort zone and into the horror genre as we explore a long-forgotten mansion and meet Viviette. That and more coming up later. Demo Bazua! Kore desu. We begin with the game that prompted the creation of this episode in the first place, A Long Road Home. The reason it got my attention initially was because of a Twitter post I happened to see about it, which described the game as a point-and-click. Granted, not all that unusual on its own, but remember the theme here. We're dealing with RPG Maker games. This generally means you're moving your character on a grid-based system using the arrow keys, using keys like Z and X to interact with objects and bring up menus. The mouse usually has subtle to do with anything. So naturally, I was intrigued by the prospect of a point-and-click made in an engine not really associated with the genre. And I wish I could say I liked it more, but the best I could say is it's kinda, sorta, alright. Firstly, to get the positives out of the way, the puzzle design is actually fairly decent and clever, and for the most part works well within the limitations of the engine, though a couple of the puzzles suffer from unclear and inconsistent solutions. For instance, early in the game you need to distract a character in this house by tossing a lit firework down a well and having the noise of the explosion amplified by the well's echo. Now quite logically, I thought I would need to find something to light the firework before tossing it, and so I spent way too much time looking for any kind of ignition source before deciding on the whim to just use the firework with the well, and it lit by itself. I had no matches, no lighter, no fire-starting thing of any kind in my inventory, but the firework still lit for some reason. So imagine my reaction when later on in the game, when you need to use a stick of dynamite to blow up some rocks and escape from a cavern, the dynamite actually does require an external ignition source to work. But here's the biggest problem with The Long Road Home. For a game which prides itself on being within a genre that relies primarily on the mouse control is not the best in the world. You can use inventory objects on parts of the environment by right-clicking what you want to interact with, then clicking the appropriate inventory item. But whether or not it works is based not just on what you click on, but where your character is. Again, using the well from earlier, you toss the firework into it by right-clicking the well, then clicking the firework. But you have to be in a very specific position in front of the well, not even just on an adjacent tile, for the game to even recognize it as a valid action. I think it would have made much more sense to just have your character walk to the target when you attempt to use an item. I mean, if you're going to tout your game, RPG Maker or otherwise, if you're going to tout it as a point and click, then, make it to where the thing interacts with what I am pointing and clicking at, not where the damn character is. Plus, there seems to be a weird bug that forces the mouse all the way to the right side of the screen when trying to hover over something near the right-hand edge. Not game-breaking by any means, since you can still click on what you're trying to click on, but no less annoying. To touch briefly on the story, it does to its credit have multiple endings, but on the whole it's very basic, and there are a couple of places where the logic is questionable, like how your character is able to take objects from a place which should be nothing more than a mental projection, and in what seems like a forced attempt at humor, there's the occasional pop culture reference that just comes out of nowhere and doesn't really fit with the general atmosphere. A Long Road Home is a fairly average game overall, but certainly not the worst I've played. Plus, it's the cheapest game on this list by far, at $1.50 to $2 depending on where you get it, with a free demo to boot. Probably worth a look if you're curious. Pegasus 5 is another example of a good idea whose execution could have done with some improvements, and it's a game which I feel suffers from a bit of an identity crisis. I can't tell if it wants to be a dating sim with some Bethesda-era Fallout-style RPG elements thrown in, or the other way around. And come to that, I don't think the game can either, because both influences seem to be in the game just for the sake of being there, and neither one adds all that much value to the overall package. First, the Fallout bits. When you begin the game, you can pick your background to give you a 2-point bonus in one of 4 stats: medicine, engineering, athletics, and charisma. Following that, you're able to put 1 more point into one of the remaining 3. Certain actions will also gain you morale, which in this game is treated as a kind of currency, which you can expend to perform various tasks. Now the dating sim bits. It should be noted that there are only heterosexual romance options available here, as Eden Vargas, the player character, is a male, and you can only have romantic relationships with the female crew members. Yes, even the robot, if the achievements are to be believed. An odd exclusion for a recent game, to be sure, and while it doesn't particularly bother me in this case, I do realize it may disappoint some people, so I still felt it worth mentioning. Though, to their credit, the dev did explain in a Steam forum post that they didn't feel they could pull off a believable gay or lesbian romance option. And the reason I feel that neither influence works well? Because neither of them feel like a primary focus, but more like an afterthought. At certain points in the game, you'll be able to add an extra point to one of the 4 stats. Emphasis on at certain points, because I can't really be more specific beyond that. If I were to give Pegasus 5 the benefit of the doubt, I'd hazard a guess that the points are doled out based on key moments in the story, because there's no progress meter available to track how close you are to earning these points, if indeed you are earning them, since otherwise the frequency feels very arbitrary. It's almost like the game occasionally remembers, oh yeah, I'm an RPG, here, mess with your stats a bit. Same with the romance options. It doesn't feel like you can pick a crew member to gradually craft a romance with over the course of the game so much as it randomly goes, hey, wanna flirt with this girl? If nothing else, at least the puzzles are once again excellently done, cleverly designed, with just the right amount of challenge to them. The Steam page for Pegasus 5 lists several features as selling points, most of which I've touched upon already, with the exception of this one: choices matter. Except they really don't. There are several moments where Eden will be required to make a decision on what course of action to take, but no matter what you pick, nothing major changes at all. Hell, the first time it happens, you're practically railroaded into the exact same outcome, regardless of your choice. Now sure, there may be minor dialogue differences here and there, but you're still playing the exact same story, going through the exact same sequences in the exact same order. There's no lasting repercussions, no this character will remember that, nothing. It's even possible to have at least one of your crewmates be killed during the course of the game. In 2 separate playthroughs, I had 2 different crew members killed off, and in both cases, the reaction of the other characters amounted to little more than, that sucks. And then on we went with the story like nothing happened. It can be hard to get a hybrid game right. We saw that with Strife, which was an FPS RPG hybrid, which came close, but it still leaned more towards the former than the latter. But even so, with Strife, both genre influences felt like they belonged, like they were a natural part of the game from the beginning. But with Pegasus 5, you have a story which, in all fairness, is a good story, but then you have dating sim and RPG elements which feel just kinda tacked on because why not? If neither influence were present and the focus were purely on the story and the puzzles, maybe with a couple of tweaks to fix some things which I felt were minor plot holes, you'd have an excellent game on your hands. Now, if you want an example of a hybrid game done right, shortly before YouTube had its most recent screwy shenanigans with the whole Kappa situation and I decided to pack up and move everything to Twitch, I had started a Let's Play series on my now defunct gameplay channel of a game called Learn Japanese to Survive Kanji Combat. That was around the beginning of the year, and although I'd always meant to get back to the game, I never picked it back up since then. So I figured now was as good a time as any to give it another try. Kanji Combat is the 3rd game in the Learn Japanese to Survive series, the first 2 being Hiragana Battle and Katakana War, and is equal parts JRPG, edutainment, city builder, and relationship manager, and it nails each aspect squarely on the head, and has an engaging story to boot. While on a trip to Japan to study the language, you make a prayer at a shrine with your teacher and the rest of your class, after which the whole damn city disappears. And as if that weren't bad enough, you soon get attacked by monsters shaped like Japanese kanji. Now you may think this sounds weird on the surface, but documentary evidence clearly shows us this is just another Tuesday over there. Anyway, the only way to defeat these kanji monsters is to smack them around a bit while shouting out their correct pronunciation. Ishi. So, seeing as your group was there to learn the language anyway, your teacher begins instructing you on the basics of Japanese kanji so you can defend yourselves long enough to figure out just what the heck is going on around here. And as long as we're on the subject, let's start talking about the combat. You may be asking yourself why I'm covering this game, the third in the series, rather than the first game, Hiragana Battle. And as a matter of fact, the original plan was just that. The main deciding factor for switching over to kanji combat was, basically, the combat. In Hiragana Battle, it's pretty much standard JRPG fare. Encounters are not only random, but quite frequent. The actions you have your party members take queue up. In other words, your characters won't actually do anything until you give all of them something to do, which means if you have multiple party members attacking the same monster and it goes down after the first hit, your next party member will attack a different monster with the pronunciation of the one that just died, so it'll count as a wrong answer and thus won't do any damage. On top of that, the Hiragana monsters get a hell of a lot tougher as you progress, and although there is a system in place that allows for occasional quick level ups for your entire party, if you want to stand a ghost of a chance against later enemies, you'll need more experience and more money for better equipment, which means grinding and lots of it. This might be fine for a normal JRPG, but in Hiragana Battle it just got to the point where I started escaping most of the battles in the hopes of getting to new lessons and eventually decided I just didn't want to go any further. A huge no-no for a game that's supposed to promote learning about anything. And so I was just going to leave it at that and capture a quick bit of footage from kanji combat just for the sake of comparison, but quickly noticed that kanji combat was so much better in every way, and I wanted to try and have at least one highly positive review for this video, so here we are. So yes, combating the kanji in kanji combat is a much improved experience indeed. For one thing, the encounters are no longer random. Instead, they're represented by kanji roaming the field, which will chase after you if you get close enough, but you're fast enough to outrun and outmaneuver them if you so choose. While in a fight, so long as you hit a kanji with its correct pronunciation, it will always go down in one hit. And you can almost guarantee hitting the kanji you want when you want, since here, when you choose an action for a character, they take that action immediately, so no more risking hitting the wrong kanji with the wrong answer, which is good, since doing so means the attacking party member takes damage. Now, grinding is still a thing in this game, since despite going down in one hit, the kanji monsters will still deal more powerful attacks as you progress. Thankfully, due to all the improvements I just mentioned, the grind is nowhere near as egregious. But as we established earlier, fighting monsters isn't the primary focus of the game. As the title suggests, you are surviving by learning Japanese, and I have to say, the kanji lessons are pretty darn effective. With each character you learn, you're given a breakdown on the direction and order of the strokes, both of which are very important in Japanese writing, as well as the various pronunciations each kanji has and which ones to use when reading the character by itself or combined with other kanji. You're also given a mnemonic to help memorize the kanji and its meaning, and while most of them make sense, in my opinion, they kind of start to go off the deep end the further you go into the game. Nonetheless, I found that by taking careful notes and practicing writing each kanji, when combined of course with combat encounters, the lessons stuck with me, even after putting the game down for a bit. In between learning sets of kanji and putting that knowledge to the test on the battlefield, your other task is to build yourself a settlement, since most of the cities of the world have disappeared. When you win combat encounters, in addition to money, which in this series is Japanese yen naturally, you also gain various types of orbs. These orbs serve as materials that you can use to construct and later upgrade various buildings like shops, a dormitory, and even wheat and rice fields to bring in a steady flow of cash. And on top of all of that, you can strengthen your bonds with each of the characters in your party. Now, I'm not sure what exactly triggers a bond to grow, but it's clearly tied to combat in some ways, since I noticed that party members that I tend to leave behind in the town aren't affected. Regardless, once your bond with another character reaches a certain threshold, talking to them will trigger a cutscene, after which they'll learn a special spell unique to that character, which gets more powerful as your bond grows stronger. I referred to this at the start of the segment as being akin to a relationship manager rather than a straight-up dating sim, since despite the meteors being made of hearts, it doesn't seem like you can actually date characters in this game, which I'll admit I was slightly disappointed about at first, but at the same time, I can see how that might distract a bit from the overall package. You can go into a character's bedroom in the dormitory once you've fully bonded, but all that lets you do is watch the cutscenes you've unlocked with them. The only real gripes I have with this game are minor nitpicks, like the fact that your students are all supposed to be international. Priya is from India, Elliot is British, Holly, a character you meet later, is from New Zealand. Hell, your player character is from whatever country you want them to be from, yet they all speak with American accents, save Elliot, who has a British accent, and unless I've missed it, there doesn't appear to be an in-story justification for this. Also, you can customize the keys to your heart's content, but just be wary that some of the keybinds may not work. I tried assigning the menu to X, which is sort of traditional for RPG Maker games, but it never worked for some reason, and I had to use Escape. Nitpicks aside, there is a ton of stuff to do in kanji combat, which ensures that even when you're not learning kanji, you'll always have something to keep your attention. Now, I still haven't finished the game yet, but that's only because I had to get this segment of the script written or I'd never get the video done. But you better believe, once I do get this video out, I'm going back to finish my lessons. Of all the games I'm looking at for this video, World's Dawn is probably the one that caught me by surprise the most. Now, I've played some RPG Maker games, even before making this video, and I've even messed around with the VX Ace and MV versions of the engine myself, so I have some idea as to what it's capable of doing. But even so, a farming sim is not really something I would have expected to see from it. And yet, a solo game dev who goes by Wayward Prophet would seem to have done it, and somewhat successfully as well. The game's website claims that it was inspired by the Harvest Moon series, and while I can see the thematic similarities, I never really played any of the Harvest Moon games myself, so I can't speak to how close they are mechanically speaking. There are, however, some definite influences from another farming game you may have heard of by the name of Stardew Valley. Putting aside the obvious aspect of the farm, both games feature your character coming to a small village and trying to revitalize it. You can build relationships and even get married in both games. There are side activities like mining and fishing and occasional festivals to take part in. World's Dawn does have some limits on the things you can do. Whether this is by deliberate choice or due to limitations from the engine, I'm not sure, but for instance, when putting things in your shipping crate to be sold, you can only select one item to place in the crate at a time before the menu closes. Now, if you have more than one of that particular item, you can select how many to sell at once, but if you want to put a different type of item in, then you've got to interact with the crate again. There's also no way to change the key bindings, and come to that, no in-game options menu at all. The closest you get is a pop-up window accessed from the title screen. But in many ways, World's Dawn is a lot more welcoming and forgiving than Stardew. The biggest example of this is your energy meter. If you run out of energy, rather than fainting and one of the villagers finding you and sending you back home after helping themselves to some of your gold, in World's Dawn you're automatically sent back to your house and into bed, with the only real penalty being that you wake up the next morning with your energy meter half filled rather than full. Also, the days end at midnight rather than 2 a.m. as in Stardew, but here, running out of time again merely results in you just getting sent to your house. But this time, you're still able to do things before you decide to go to bed for the night, since time doesn't pass while you're in your house. I mentioned the energy meter and not the health meter because in this game there is no health meter, and there is no health meter in this game because there is no combat in this game. So what does that mean for you? Well, basically, when you go mining, you go mining. That's it. No monsters to worry about having to kill, or indeed to worry about killing you. Fishing, too, has been made more accessible here in World's Dawn, requiring far less hand-eye coordination and more just a general sense of good timing. Although Stardew does still have a point in its favor with regards to the fishing, since here you have to have some bait in your inventory before you can fish, whereas in Stardew, all you need is the rod. The bait just makes it easier. You have a dog in both games, but here in World's Dawn, the pooch is much more beneficial. For one thing, you have him from the start of the game. Later on, you can send the dog on an errand to buy seeds or farm supplies, which on the one hand takes about half as long as it would if you walked there yourself, but the downside is he can only buy one type of item and can't carry as many of that item as you can. You can also bring the dog with you as you walk around town, which has two benefits. Firstly, the dog will alert you to the presence of coins buried in the dirt, which you can get at with your spade. And secondly, you have a freaking adorable puppy following you around everywhere. What's not to love? Oh yeah, and you can play fetch with it once you buy a rubber ball. I may or may not have had a huge grin on my face while doing this. World's Dawn does still have some negatives to it in addition to the ones I mentioned earlier. The characters tend to repeat dialogue quite a bit, even as you get into a serious romance with them, which makes them feel not nearly as natural or personable as they could. It's also difficult to pin down their personal schedules, making it hard to track them down to give them a gift when you want to. Plus, I noticed the controls feel a bit non-responsive at times, particularly when playing the lockball minigame. Very occasional, though, and not enough to put a damper on what is otherwise a pleasant surprise from the realm of RPG Maker. After all, it probably speaks volumes about the game that here again, the only reason I didn't finish was due to time constraints. And there's another benefit World's Dawn has over Stardew Valley that I didn't mention yet, the price tag, with Worlds being $5 cheaper than Stardew. And like Kanji Combat, this is another game that I absolutely cannot wait to get back to. I mean, after all, that ball ain't gonna fetch itself. Scary games are something of a rarity around these parts. If you know me, you know why. Basically, I can't stand jump scares. Though more recently, that's more due to the general overuse of the jump scare more than the actual scare factor. Although, the scare factor still has much to do with it. But when I saw Viviette on Steam, two things immediately jumped out at me. Probably could have found a better way of saying that. First was the absolutely fantastic art style, and second was the promise of good puzzles. And it was ultimately both of these factors that won out over my usual reluctance to go anywhere near the horror genre. The first good thing that caught my eye while playing the game was the opening cutscene, showcasing that brilliant visual aesthetic and giving us the promise of a gripping story. The first bad thing that caught my eye was the cutscenes are unskippable. Annoying enough on its own, but especially irksome here, considering that for reasons we'll get into later, you're more than likely going to want to play this game twice. Our protagonist, Jules Fawcett, along with his sister and some of their friends, have made their way into this abandoned mansion in an attempt to contact ghosts. When that attempt has apparently failed, the group prepares to leave, when they notice that Felice, Jules' sister, still hasn't come out of the house. So Jules goes in after, only to be met with
Holy Jesus Christ!
You wake up after a while, and after grabbing a lantern from your boat, you begin to explore the mansion and try to rescue your sister. I do shy away from horror games as a rule, but if I absolutely had to play one, Viviette would be the kind I'd like to play. Sure, there's still the occasional jump scare moment, but for one thing, they're not the cliched, ear-shattering loud noise, big scary face on the screen type of thing. They're more subtle. A statue moving here, a jack-in-the-box there. Plus, the scares aren't the sole thing the game has going for it. They're not overused, all of which makes them far more effective. There's also a save system in place. A few rooms in the house have a flashing journal in them, which you can use to access the save menu and record your progress in one of 10 slots, which, now that I think of it, is maybe kind of generous for a horror game. I mean, I'd have thought having far less slots, like 2 or maybe 3 at the most, would also be a good way to add to the tension, because it would make you far more careful as to when you save in case you royally screw something up. Still, it's nice to have nonetheless. Plus, Viviette manages to subvert a couple of tropes which I think show up in far too many games. As I mentioned earlier, before going into the mansion, you grab a lantern from your boat, which you need because you're exploring at night and it's pitch dark inside. But you don't need to worry about having to recharge or refill your lantern because it never goes out unless you turn it off. Although there will be moments when the lantern flickers, which I think adds to the unsettling atmosphere far more than any of the scares. Also, there's a run button, which is not only handy for getting around the grounds quickly, but is also required for a couple of points in the game where Felice, who has been possessed by the ghost of Viviette, actively tries to hunt you down and kill you. Now, if you run for long enough, you may hear Jules start to pant for breath. But, as far as I can tell, and I tested this to be sure, the panting is just for dramatic effect. There doesn't appear to be a stamina mechanic, and you won't have to worry about slowing down from running out of breath. Even the story doesn't get into the way of things. While playing, there will be 1 or 2 cutscenes to give you some story for Jules and Felice, and there are documents you can find for backstory, but after the intro cutscene, the plot sort of takes a back seat to the real star of the show, the puzzles. I was promised good puzzles, and I have to say on the whole, Viviette delivers. Each of the puzzles has a clue to its solution somewhere on the premises. You should never have a situation where you have to brute force your way through a problem. The design of the puzzles is nothing short of superb, in many cases requiring a keen attention to detail, and while they may stump you at first, the moment you notice what's going on and the solution clicks is so satisfying. I do have my gripes with some of them, however. For instance, in this room there's a bookshelf that you could push to reveal a secret room, and it's quite obvious that you can push it due to the marks on the wall and the floor. But apparently it ain't all that obvious to old Jules here, since you have to go and actively inspect the scratches before he'll push the bookcase. Now, I've seen this in other games, and I don't like it. If I, the player, can see that something can be done, and there isn't something actively preventing that thing from being done, then let me do the thing. If I see quite clearly that a bookcase can be pushed, then either don't make me inspect some minute detail that I already know about, or at the very least, make that requirement consistent throughout the whole game, since guess what? There's some statues you can push outside for another puzzle, which don't require inspecting anything whatsoever. One of the more annoying puzzles involves this statue with 6 arms, each of which has a corresponding button that lights a fire in its respective hand when pressed. The idea behind the puzzle is simple enough. You have to light all 6 fires in a particular order, at which point you'll gain a key to some of the doors in the house. You'll get that sequence by pressing a button on a similar statue on the other side of the house. But here's the thing though. If you press that button again, or if you mess up when inputting the sequence of the first statue, the order changes and you have to go back to the second statue and memorize it again. This by itself would be a minor annoyance, but what adds to the frustration is that the moment you're solving that puzzle takes place during one of those sections where Felice is trying to kill you, which means screwing up not only means having to go from one side of the house to the other, but you may have to detour your way there and back as well. Viviette is kind of a short game. Going in blind for my first playthrough, I clocked in at around 3 hours. But the reason I said you'll want to play it at least twice is because there are multiple endings. And I'm not going to spoil anything about them here story-wise, but I will say that to get the best ending, you have to do certain things which are not obvious at all. Otherwise you'll get one of the bad endings, which I think is kind of an unnecessarily harsh and unfair punishment to the player. I think if you're going to tie something behind having to take obscure steps, then make it some kind of bonus content. Don't make it tied to the story. Still, all in all, I greatly enjoyed my time with Viviette, and I'm glad I took a chance on it. That'll do it for this episode of QuickTime Event. I hope you enjoyed it. As always, if there's a game you think I missed, or if there's a theme or genre you'd like to see me cover for the show, then get in touch with me, either on Twitter or Discord. And if you'd like to support the channel, there are several ways you can do so. Just click the Show More link below the video player here on Twitch for links to my tip jar and my Patreon, and if you haven't already, then consider following and subscribing here to the channel. Jikai Mane! Sayonara!